You're watching Beyond 100 Days. The United Nations meets in emergency session to debate the attack in Syria.
But since Russia will veto any action against Assad, what's the point?
President Trump and his generals say they're not ruling anything out, but even a US strike wouldn't mean there's a US strategy.
We are studying that situation extremely closely. We are meeting with our military and everybody else, and we'll be making some major decisions over the next 24 to 48 hours.
Mixed messages from the White House on a possible trade war with China. It may happen or it may not. Your guess is as good as ours.
Also on the program, millions of Facebook users around the world are checking their accounts as the social network reveals if their personal data has been shared.
We're gonna rise up, ain't time to take a shot. We're gonna rise up, ain't time to take a shot.
And it's a big hit with audiences on both sides of the Atlantic. The US hip-hop musical Hamilton wins big on British theatre's biggest night. Do get in touch with us using the hashtag Beyond100Days.
Hello, I'm Katty Kay in Washington. Clive Myrie is in London. Christian is off this week. The United Nations will meet to discuss the suspected chemical attack in Syria. But honestly, we all know the outcome of any such emergency meetings. Western powers will denounce the horrific scenes, likely propose some form of sanction, which Moscow will then veto.
Yeah, so far so predictable. From London to Paris to Washington, global powers say President Assad and his Russian backers must be held to account. But if there's not going to be any action from the UN, it's more than likely to come from Washington. Here's our Middle East editor, Jeremy Bowen, and you might find some of the images in his report distressing.
This is the aftermath of what witnesses said was a chemical attack as Douma, a town just outside Damascus, fell to the regime. We're not showing you pictures we have of dozens of dead bodies with foam on their mouths, which can be a sign of a chemical attack. What happened looks likely to extract a response from Western countries, a big price to be paid by Syria's President Assad and his Russian and Iranian backers, according to President Trump.
We'll be making some major decisions over the next 24 to 48 hours. If it's Russia, if it's Syria, if it's Iran, if it's all of them together, we'll figure it out and we'll know the answers quite soon.
In Moscow, Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, said there was no evidence for the Western accusations.
Our military on the ground in the Syrian Arab Republic had warned several times that a serious provocation is being prepared. The Syrian government also spoke about that. A serious provocation aimed at accusing Damascus once again for using chemical poisonous substances against civilian population.
In 7 years of fighting, the war has changed from a campaign to overthrow the regime to a mini-world war that's being fought by many of the world's most powerful countries and looks to be escalating. A year ago, the Americans retaliated after another chemical attack on Syrian civilians. It was mostly symbolic. The Assad regime, with Russian and Iranian help, has continued to strengthen its position. From the start of the war, the US, Britain and their allies called for President Assad to go. But they didn't back their words with deeds. When the president was vulnerable, the US and the UK chose not to act. Now he has the firm backing of Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, and of course, Russia's President Putin. That makes him stronger now than at any time since the war began in 2011. It's hard to see what the West can do to change that. The Americans and the British missed their chance. In the last 48 hours, Syria's mini-world war has been heating up. This is said to be an Israeli jet crossing Lebanon to raid Syria. In February, the Israelis had a plane shot down as it hit the same target, an airbase called T4. Hitting T4 was not about chemical weapons, but Israel's fight with Iran. Supporters of President Assad took to the streets in Aleppo, the city in which the coalition between the Syrian regime, the Russians, and the Iranians scored their first significant victory. They still look to be the war's big winners, and it's hard to see how Western retaliation for the latest chemical attack is going to change that. Jeremy Bowen, BBC News.
Let's get the latest now from Neda Tawfiq, who joins us from the United Nations in New York. Neda, we're all expecting lots of words of condemnation over what's alleged to have happened in Syria, but are we actually likely to get anything concrete beyond that?
To be honest, not really. The United States is proposing a new resolution. It pretty much revived an old one. It had to set up a new independent investigation inquiry to look into cases of chemical weapons use and to try to hold those who the UN finds responsible accountable. Now, Russia has vetoed that type of resolution in the past twice before when the last mechanism ran out and the UN Security Council tried to renew that. And quite frankly, when that old mechanism had found that the Syrian government was responsible for using chemical weapons, along with the group that calls itself the Islamic State, the UN Security Council was too divided to do anything about it anyway. So what experts are really saying is that this is just a step for the United States and France and Britain to say, we have tried once more through international mechanisms to get Russia on board, to get investigation underway, and experts believe that this could just be a tick in the box on the way to stronger unilateral military action.
Okay, Neda Tawfiq there at the United Nations, thanks very much. So what are the other options and what might President Trump himself decide to do? Former US Defense Secretary William Cohen joins me now in the studio. Secretary Cohen, given that the United Nations is really not united on the issue of Syria, and as Neda said, Russia's going to veto any propositions anyway, would it be better if these discussions were being held perhaps in a NATO context in Brussels?
I think ultimately they will be held under those circumstances. It doesn't make much sense other than to raise the profile of what the Russians, who the Russians have been supporting, and what Assad has been doing. I think Russia, Iran have to be seen as being complicit in war crimes, in crimes against humanity, to the extent that they are supporting a regime that will use poison gas on innocent civilians. They're just as guilty as he is. So we can raise that. They can raise that at the UN and be vetoed. But the world ought to know who they're dealing with here and what kind of regime the Russians and the Iranians are supporting. So I think ultimately it'll go to the NATO countries to say, can we act in concert, number one, on a military basis, but most importantly, real serious sanctions against Russia, against Syria, against Iran. And that would be on a multilateral basis, not authorized by the UN, since it won't get through, but by the NATO countries.
So General Mattis has already said all options on the table. We heard President Trump today. He's making it pretty clear that he's weighing his military options as well. What could the US do on a unilateral basis that would have more impact than the strike the president launched a year ago?
Well, it would have to be something more than a strike. It has to be a strategy. It has to be look at what happens steps 2, 3, and 4. I think it has to be more than just a symbolic target. I think it has to be something that it will have real military consequences, like taking part of his Air Force down. That would be something that would prevent him from using poison gas again, or at least limit it. He can certainly do it by artillery shells and other means, but he's been using helicopters and aircraft to deliver it. That might be one object. Secretary Mattis, I'm sure, has a panoply of targets if they choose to go the military way. But I would think the military is only a part of it. Real serious economic sanctions that bite against the economic interests of both three, the Iranians, the Russians, and the Syrians.
Bill Cohen, it's Clive Myrie here in London. Do you discern any overarching strategy from the Trump administration when it comes to Syria?
No, I don't. And I think the president has been kind of back and forth on this. His instinct is to get out. It's something he pledged to do during his campaign. When he proposed that, he could see the reaction coming from his military advisors saying, this is going to allow Russia, Iran, and Syria to have a relationship and a geostrategic position that's going to put Israel in danger, Saudi Arabia, UAE. All of those countries will now be subject to this kind of combination of evildoers as such. The new cast of real countries who are doing something that's quite disturbing internationally.
Okay, Bill Cohen, stay with us because we want to ask you about China in just a second. But something interesting happened over the weekend, Clive, and that was the reaction that Donald Trump got from some Republicans. You know, the speculation here is that President Assad is kind of painting Donald Trump into a box in some ways, testing America's will. There's Donald Trump saying we want to get out of Syria. Well, do they really want to get out of Syria? Have a listen to what Republican Senator Lindsey Graham said over the weekend, speaking Donald Trump's kind of language.
If he doesn't follow through and live up to that tweet, he's going to look weak in the eyes of Russia and Iran. So this is a defining moment, Mr. President. You need to follow through with that tweet, show a resolve that Obama never did to get this right.
So, you know, I mean, that is the kind of thing, I think, Clive, that Donald Trump can respond to. He does not want to be seen to be weak. So it'll be interesting if that's the kind of language that pushes him to take action.
It will indeed, but he, of course, perhaps has painted himself into a corner when it comes to Syria. If you listen to Senator John McCain, it's the suggestion that American troops will be pulled out of Syria because he believes, the president believes, that the war against Islamic State has been won, that perhaps emboldened President Assad to use his chemical weapons. That's a suggestion from some. And the bottom line is presidential words have power, even in tweets.
Right. Right, we'll see. We'll know in the next 24 hours or so what he's going to do.
Well, Syria isn't the only big issue where the world is waiting to see what President Trump will do. The same goes for trade with China.
Yeah, today Mr. Trump again said that the U.S. has terrible terms of trade with Beijing, and he's determined to change that, pointing fingers as to who's responsible for the imbalance. Take a listen.
I don't blame China. I blame the people running our country. I blame presidents. I blame representatives. I blame negotiators. We should have been able to do what they did. We didn't do it. They did. And it's the most lopsided set of trade rules, regulations that anybody's ever seen.
Yeah, and after a crazy week on the markets last week, which saw a lot of falls, they did seem to be reassured today that a full-on trade war could be averted. The truth is, however, we really just don't know that. William Cohen is still with us. He's just got back from China. I want to ask you about that. When you went to China, amidst all of this talk of a possible trade war with the United States, what was the reaction you got from officials in Beijing?
Well, I've been going to China for 40 years now, and I've noticed a real change in attitude. And the Chinese feel empowered now. Their economy is still proceeding quite nicely. They feel strong economically and growing, and militarily they're growing as well. So I think their attitude is, we don't want a trade war. We're not afraid of one. And so I think the attitude is one, let's see if we can't sit down and work this out. And by the way, while all of this rhetoric was going back and forth, I was meeting with officials who then alerted me to the fact that private conversations were in fact taking place between the Treasury Secretary and his counterparts in China. So the rhetoric is up here. The reality was, let's find a way to discuss this privately, which is the way it should be done. But I think the president's right to raise the issue. It's been going on too long. But now the time is to sit down and work it out. And you can't do it by simply having this volley of rhetoric going back and forth.
Indeed. Why do you think, then, that the president began this whole attempt to try and rein in the Chinese by threatening to slap tariffs on them, and then the next day turn around and say, well, I'm best friends with President Xi, I don't blame the Chinese, I blame everybody else? Is that because the Chinese have said, look, we can hit you back and hard?
Well, the president has a way of making, firing a shot and then aiming. And I think if you look at the tariffs that were put on steel and aluminum, they hit not China, they hit Canada, they hit Mexico, they hit the South Koreans, they hit all of our friends, but not the Chinese. So then he had to kind of backtrack and then say, here are some exemptions. For all of you folks who are concerned about this, you'll be exempted. It's proper to target the Chinese and say, you haven't been playing fair. We want you to have a much more level playing field for us to play on, and we haven't had one. So now we've got your attention. Let's